So let's please welcome Patrik and Jeffrey to the stage.
You go first.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Center for Fiction for sponsoring this event. As you said, this is my debut novel, and as a debut novelist, we need all the publicity we can get. So and it's great to be in a wonderful place like the Center for Fiction. To start things off in the spirit of openings, I'm going to read a little bit from the opening of the novel, and then we'll have our conversation. So just by way of introduction, this takes place in a little village on the edge of Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the year is 1918. The chapter opening is called Dog Trot Fever. Newborns are never afflicted with the malady. The swollen tongue, the reddish throat, the raw cough seems to afflict only babies older than 6 months. By the spring, in the village situated on a small knuckle-shaped peninsula just north of Halifax, all 5 of the stricken babies have now developed a high fever. Having no luck with sweet milk and lemon bitter, worried mothers administer castor oil mixed with camphor, then a tea of beer's root steeped with beech ash and clover. When desperate, they even place a few charms under the mattresses of the babies where the stricken babies lie crying. Nothing works. In mid-April, with 3 more babies now suffering from the malady, health department nurses visit the village, their faces frozen even before they have examined a single new case. Why our children, several mothers standing in the yard of the house want to know. Hadn't Halifax already given enough babies in the fire that leveled 10 square blocks of the city months before when the munitions ship exploded in the harbor? Then again, those had been white babies. No colored babies had died in that explosion. Was it now Woods Bluff's turn to lose infants? And if so, how many? 5, 10, all 22? The following week, after 2 of the feverish babies die, the mothers turn to the grandmothers, though many are leery of this option. Already, several grandmothers have suggested that since the home remedies haven't worked, and since neither nurse nor doctor has useful medicines, the afflicted infants must be bad luck babies. It is an expression the mothers haven't heard since they were children, though the fear of having a bad luck baby had terrorized mothers on the bluff as far back as 1790. That was the year the first groups of cabins sprang up across the bluff, displacing the fox, hare, and moose that ran through the thick Christmas ferns and sheep laurel. Back then, when no medicine could reinvigorate a baby whose body had begun to show the outlines of bones, smothering was sometimes recommended. Take no action, and bad luck might infect the entire village. Best to end the child's suffering midday when injured spirits would likely be bedside, feeding on the moisture of a weak baby's last breath. Yet several mothers are unconvinced the deceased infants are bad luck babies. And even if the now suffering babies are saddled with bad luck, who's to say those old tales of smothering are true? Had anyone actually seen a mother place a blanket or pillow over a child's face? And most importantly, for these new cases, by what evidence will the diagnosis be made? The grandmothers had ready answers. For several descendants of the Virginian who came up to Nova Scotia in 1772 as a messenger in the British Army, a feverish baby had to be put to sleep if its father had recently had a limb severed above the knee or elbow. Death was also imminent if the baby's fever came during the same month as the mother's birthday. For the granddaughter of the Congolese woman who in 1785 dressed as a man sailed into Halifax harbor on a ship out of Lisbon, Portugal, a feverish baby had to be smothered if the newborn was smaller than a man's hand. And for the largest group of grandmothers, those descended from the nearly 200 Jamaicans who landed in Halifax harbor in 1788 After being expelled by British soldiers from the island for fomenting rebellion, a feverish baby's fate was sealed if the child coughed up blood. During the same month, a traveling man arrived on your stoop selling quill turpentine, goat leather, or gunpowder. Hadn't such a vendor made the rounds in Woods Bluff the month before? Why continue to nurse such a child? Death already had a square toe on the baby's throat. It was only a matter of weeks. A week maybe if the baby were a girl. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming out tonight to support Jeffrey and Africaville. Just briefly, when I started at HarperCollins in June of 2019, I think it took me 2 days to understand how my email worked. And so when I finally got the email, when I got to it, I realized I was really behind with compliance. Like there were all of these things I should have enrolled in or whatever. And so I was so busy getting through those, I realized that I had a submission from Aisha Pandey, who's Jeffrey's agent, who's quite a superstar literary agent and very humble and has exquisite taste. But she knew that I was at HarperCollins and I had Africaville. And what Jeffrey read, I don't believe we changed the word. And so the way you experienced hearing Jeffrey is the way I experienced reading it. And I just thought, please, God, anyone, if he can continue this, I think we may have something remarkable and extraordinary, and we do. And because of you, Jeffrey, thank you so much. So, just, Jeffrey is very patient, but he wants what he wants, just in terms of the editing process. So we were talking in the green room, and I still feel this way. Africaville is such a unique historical novel because it's a historical novel anchored in people of African descent, but enslavement isn't the specter that most shadows their life. And the Seabolt family, when we meet Kath in 1918, her parents, there's something about her that's extraordinarily ambitious. And so with her son, he would be ambitious as well. And so what I thought was incredible about the novel was here you had people of African descent, and it wasn't this other event or this other thing that was driving them. It was really their inner emotions, their inner turmoil. And we were talking about just the way that the Greeks would structure their stories that would be very different from fiction as it would evolve. Whereas with most fiction, especially England and American fiction, there's this whole notion of keeping something from someone, whether it's a lover or whether it's this goal or desire. And what the Greeks would do, they would give it to you up front. You want wax wings? Here. What are you going to do with it? And I thought that that was another aspect of Africaville that was so unique, that we were really dealing with characters who were driven purely by their emotions and not so much their circumstances. And so how did you choose? I knew you knew about that you wanted to set this in Canada, but how did you pick these particular people to populate all of Halifax and Africaville?
Well, as you mentioned, and also thank you for purchasing the novel.
Acquiring
the novel.
Yes, yeah.
Well, you know, the Seabolts came out of a lot of research, first of all, and also my own personal experiences. The family, the matriarch of the family, Kath Ella, grew up in this little village called, I called Africaville. And that village really came out of the research I'd done. I was working on a series of stories set in the South. And the stories had come out of my experiences living in the South. I'm from Alabama, but I have a grandmother who grew up in rural Alabama. And I had been following the Selma to Montgomery March. And so I began writing about the rural families who lived along the Selma to Montgomery March, because we hear a lot about the march itself and the people who participated in the march. But I began to wonder about the people who lived along the route. What were they like? Did they participate in the march? And if so, why? If they did not, why didn't they? And so I began to write these stories about these communities along that rural area. And the stories took place over the 50s, 60s, 70s. By the time I got to the 80s, I went back home to visit. This is sort of mirroring my own life. And a lot of those towns were no longer there. And so I began to hear stories about these rural towns in Alabama. And around 2001, I read an article in the New York Times about this village in Halifax that was in the news in the 60s when it was destroyed over the objections of the residents. And I thought, well, that's also a village that is no longer there. And so I felt an immediate connection listening to some of the video. The BBC did a whole video series on them. There was a lot of articles about them. And I felt a strong connection for some reason to this community and listening to these people tell their stories. And so really the Seaboat family grew out of my interest in that community. And so I began to do research about the community and sort of built it in a number of ways. And Cathala really was, you'll see in the opening of the novel when I was talking about the Jamaicans, but the community that I built was really based on sort of three major events. One was war. A lot of blacks who came up to Canada came up on the Underground Railroad. I mean, the estimates are that about 100,000 blacks came north, and about a third of those went on to Canada, some to Quebec, Montreal area, some also to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So that group became part of the novel. And then the War of 1812, which was, some historians say, was the largest emancipation of blacks prior to the Civil War. A lot of blacks came up to Canada. The British were saying to you, leave the plantations, come up to Canada, and a lot of blacks took them up on that. And so Africaville was the people who came up on the Underground Railroad, people who came up during the War of 1812, and then finally this large group of people who came up from Jamaica. I mean, the Jamaicans were causing trouble for the British throughout their history of enslavement, and some of them would run away from the plantations.
But it was good trouble.
Yes, it was good trouble. And they would form communities. And some of these communities, once they had even more trouble, or began to have even more good trouble, they would get rounded up and moved around the Commonwealth. And some of them came to Halifax. And so it was really my research into this group of Jamaicans that came to Halifax that I began to think of Cathala, the matriarch of the family. She sort of came out of that experience. And then the man who she had her son with, Omar, actually was a Southerner. And his family came up to Canada further north to a place called Cape Breton. During my research, I discovered that a lot of blacks from Mississippi and Alabama came up to Canada in the 1800s to work in the mines, various mines, the coal mines and those kinds of things. And so out of that, those two sort of strains, sort of the Cathala's community there in Africaville, and then the small community of Southerners in Cape Breton became the genesis of the Seaboats. But it was mainly really Cathala was the matriarch. Her story really is what frames the opening of the book, sort of how she came to be.
Right, so when Aisha finally released the manuscript and sent it to me, exclusively, I would say. So you had been working on the manuscript for at least 18 years. What was going on in the 18 years? Because they began as a series of stories,
Yes.
but walk us through what that process was like.
Okay, well, once the stories had been written, and once I'd read this article, I had decided, well, I think the story of this town might be an interesting one, but I knew there had to be a connection between that town and the stories I was writing about the South. And so the question was how to make that happen. And so I just began to write various stories about the village itself and continue the stories I had about the South, and then write about how the Southerners got up to Cape Breton. So it was a series, I guess, three different, writing tasks that I set about myself, with the hope that eventually the strands would come together. But and then there was also the story of the town of Africaville, how it came together. In the novel, I would say the spine of the book really is this idea of the birth, maturity, death, and I guess transcendence of the village of Africaville. So that's one of the threads of the novel. And that seemed to be the place that held the novel together. And also these two stories of this family from the South, Omar, his family from the South, and then the family from the village of Africaville that started the Seaboats, also were glue for the novel. But I started out with a number of subplots, some of which did not make it into the final novel.
I will never hear the end of that.
Yes.
These subplots did not make it. Never hear the end of it.
Which I would say about the 5-year mark, I had taken out one of the subplots having to do with the Southern story Then I put it back in at about the 8-year mark. And then I also had 4 generations. There were 4 generations. So the novel swelled to about 700 pages. And then I sold it to Aisha. And after about 2 or 3 years of back and forth, the 4th generation left the book, but various subplots remained. And then I gave it to Patrik, and then we worked on it. And then out of that, there was some, shall we say, difficult excising of various subplots. So from 600 pages, it was probably down to about 500 or so. You and I worked together. We probably cut 1 major subplot and 2 or 3 other minor subplots, and added a new ending.
Yeah. 2
new chapters for the ending.
Yes.
And so I would say it was a very arduous process of the whole not the 2.5 years.
I was there for a year of it. So,
yes.
And so what essentially was happening with Jeffrey's manuscript was the core characters are so electrifying. I mean, they come alive on the page, and this is parallel to Africaville, which is its own character, and it's changing and morphing as well. And so there would be a gathering, and Jeffrey would have everybody in the town at that gathering. And I'm like, okay, well, what is Kendra thinking right now? So to pare away the characters who weren't essential to the narrative, so it sort of freed the narrative up in a certain way, because mobility is a huge part of Africaville. I mean, characters are constantly moving. Even internally, they're moving, growing all the time. One of the aspects of the novel that I didn't think needed any work, and now I'm happy to have this conversation with you about it, is the choice of a character passing for white. You know, I left that alone. And so what motivated that move from the character? And not only does he pass, not that I'm doing a spoiler alert, but he leaves New England and passes for white in Alabama. So what prompted that?
Well, one of the things that was always present in the novel is obviously the town of Africaville. And so the question, because everything is related to that. And so even passing had to be related to that. And so I was interested in exploring what elements within a character would make them close to this town of Africaville, people who were no longer there and their descendants, what would draw them to Africaville, and also what might pull them away from the town. And it was easy to come up with the things that would draw the people to Africaville. Obviously, the residents are still alive. There are wonderful stories being told about the town, the community that was involved. There were wonderful former leaders in the town still around. And so people had a very strong connection to the town. So in my novel, that was sort of easier to manifest. What was more difficult then was to come up with something that would draw them away from the town. And I thought that if I had a character who was light enough to pass for white, they would at least be tempted in some cases to do that. Not that they would. And so there was characters in the novel who are drawn away from Africaville by both distance, moving away from the town, and also their decision to pass. And this happens in the subsequent generations. In the case of Etienne, which is the 2nd generation of seaboats, he decides to pass, and his struggle really is internal. What propels that part of the novel is how he makes decisions, what those decisions do to him, and his relationships to his family and to his colleagues and to his son. In his 3rd generation, this character does not find out that he has a black relative until later on. And his journey really is external. He tries to get back to Africaville, to get connected, but there's difficulty. I mean, the town, everyone knows that his father was passing, and so the people are not having it. So his struggle is to get back in their good graces, and he wants to do that. And so in the case of so passing allowed me to, A, continue to work with Africaville, and then B, also look at both internal struggles, in the case of Etienne and his decisions, and also a character who has these outside struggles as well. He wants something, but has difficulty getting it.
Right, and you instead of passing, you call it crowing.
Right.
And his relative, who he encounters many, many years later, she's disgusted by that decision. I mean, it's because she is so much a part of what Africaville is, this great, tremendous pride. And this, when you get to that section of the novel, just hold your breath because it's pretty breathtaking. The language that many of you heard, well, all of you heard at the very beginning, the opening passages, the language, the writing, Jeffrey, is so exquisite. I mean, it's just like poetry. And when you do these tremendous set pieces around Kendra, I won't give anything away. But each section there's a set piece, and the set piece is there for a reason. It's not pretension. It's not. It just mirrors the elegance that you believe or you want to believe will be a part of Africaville. That some of that beauty and that elegance is a part of that particular community. Did you have any influences on you in terms of the writing of the novel, or people that you read along those 20 years that influenced you?
Well, in terms of the actual, I wanted the novel to have a certain feel to it. There's this idea of that Africaville is always present. That was one of the things I wanted to do. And I was able to capture that, I believe, through the use of the present tense. I mean, that is one of the, so that was quite a challenge to do that. When I was a first-time novelist, and to write a novel in the present tense for that many pages was quite a challenge, because you don't get a lot of the tools you can use in writing in the past tense. And so it was a challenge to get that to work, but I knew if I could get that part of the novel situated, then I think that what I was trying to do in terms of this idea of Africa being an ever-present part of the book, that would help with that. So that was one of the things that I both struggled with, but I think was necessary in the book. In terms of influences, one of my favorite authors, obviously, is Zora Neale Hurston. I've written about her in several occasions for several publications. The fact that she was born in Alabama is certainly one of the, you hear about authors, particularly from the place that you're from, and you go and read them. But to me, what was so compelling about her is that she didn't have all the antecedents that we had, or even Toni Morrison. When Toni Morrison was writing, I mean, she had other black writers. There were other black writers who had been published. When Zora Neale Hurston was writing, there were very few places she could go to say, hey, let me read this black author to see how I need to write about these kinds of black characters. She wholly invented herself. That's very difficult to do for a writer in my generation. I mean, there's too many, no matter what I do, someone will say, well, you sound like this person, or you sound like that person. But no one sounds like Zora Neale. So she was always, her singular voice was what I was always interested in. And so she's one influence, of course. And I've read very widely, and so I just, I love a lot of the big authors, Dickens and the writers who write with a lot of characters. I'm sure we talked about this many times as we were cutting out characters for my book, just about how the best way to incorporate a lot of characters in what works and what doesn't. And so those conversations were very useful and I think very interesting, and ones that I like to have because I like reading these novels like that. So those kinds of big novels. In addition to that, obviously Toni Morrison is always an influence. I mean, she wrote about a lot of the things that there are parts in the book that people, I'm sure, who've read her will pick up on. Even like Zora Neale, the square toe. I mean, that's from Their Eyes Are Watching God, that big man with the square toe. And even so, in the book, I'll have some of my influences in there as well. So those are probably the major ones, I would say.
So Jeffrey and I would have conversations about eliminating characters, and so I knew that Dickens was a huge influence, and so I talked less about Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston, and I said, Jeffrey, you do realize that when Dickens was writing, that it was serialized, and that it was almost like like a radio drama or some Netflix addiction, where people were waiting at the boat to get the serialized version of it. But ultimately, he had to cut some of those characters out. So you're not serializing it.
To which I would reply, Patrik, you know that this character is very important because he or she does X, Y, and Z. So we go back and forth.
Yeah, no, we would. I mean, but that was the great thing about the collaborative process, because there has to be a level of trust. I mean, this is my first time editing in a major publishing house. This is his first novel, that he took a chance on me and that we were taking a chance on each other. I have Tracy Sherrod and a wonderful group of people who are guiding me, and you had Aisha, so I thought, we'd be fine. But it was also a novel in which I could tell that you had lived with these characters for a long time, and letting any of them go was not going to be an easy transition. So keeping the characters that we kept, and it's not like we did like a massacre, the way he tells it, but it's not that many that left. But then keeping the core there,
yes.
I thought only strengthened what was an already strong novel. And for anyone who struggles with writing an ending where you've gone through this incredible journey, literally over 3 generations, and when we did the notes, and I'd say, here they are, Jeffrey. Where did you go off to? Did you go off state?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that, because I did think that the editorial letters were certainly very direct. It was one of the things as a new writer, I didn't expect them to be so well direct. You have this conversation where everyone loves the book, and then you get a letter, single-spaced, with everything very clearly laid out. It was I have to say though, it was very, very easy to take in after a few drinks, to take in and absorb. And once I went back and read it, after sitting it aside for a week, I went back and read it. Everything was very clear. The thing that I found interesting also was that the amount of time that I was given to do the changes, at first was really, my God, I'll never be able to do this. You must have thought I could. It's very truncated. You don't get much time to do the revisions. I'm used to just taking 6 months to do this. And you were like, well, here it is, and this is when it's due. And so that was very difficult. And so with the ending, what I really had to do was go away. I did a residency at a place called Hambidge in Georgia. Otherwise, I would not have been able. It was quite a chore to take out a chapter and then add 2 and redo the ending. It was quite it's not, wasn't easy, but I thought it was, I thought that the process was very useful and also very, worked out well on the book. But that was one thing I was surprised about, just at the way in which the deadlines in which you have to do the revisions. I had never done it before, and it was very tight, long deadlines.
There are some novelists who still haven't turned their manuscripts in, so this is why we have deadlines. But I thought that the way you tied everything together, because again, there are these breathtaking, all I can call them like set pieces, and so it wasn't that was lacking in the last fourth. It was just that so many of those amazing pieces. I was looking for some balance that sort of ended in what you were able to do. When you get to the ending, it's pretty incredible how he tied all of these particular. They weren't even loose ends. It was just you had to believe through emotion. You had to believe in the character that this is how this ends. And so you had to understand everything that preceded that. You had to trust these characters, that this would make complete sense, that someone who had been mentioned in the novel earlier, and we kept her, and so and then to get to that place of optimism, of complete optimism. There was also a lot of joy in the book. I found. Less once Etienne got to Alabama, but throughout there is a certain sense of aspiration and optimism. I think that colors the pages. That is also refreshing, I would say, for historical fiction, but specifically for historical fiction that's anchored in the African American presence. So for that, I thank you. Am I being told to? I'm hallucinating. Okay, I'm so sorry. Talk about the friendship between Kathella and Keandra, which it's 2 friends who go into divergent paths, and when they go into divergent paths, the novel will never be the same again.
Well, those 2 characters are very interesting. Kathella, as I mentioned, sort of the matriarch of the Seabolt family, lives in this community that becomes Africaville, but she wants more out of her life. And so she studies hard, and she wants to get this scholarship to go to Montreal or to college. Kendra, her friend, in the book, someone asked me a question about this, actually, on a radio show a few days ago. Her thing is that this is a young woman who is living in a community beset by racism and poverty as well as oppression, who survived the fever, but has mental diminished, a little bit of a diminished mental capacity. And so I wanted to explore how does that play out in a community when you have a exchange with police or the justice system, because that comes up a lot nowadays. This idea of what do you do with people who may not have the mental capacity or who may be mentally impaired for various reasons? How does that play out? So I wanted to look at both Cathala, and a person who is aspirational and wants to get away and is very smart, what kinds of things she comes up against in her effort to get out of the community, and also Kendra, a very bright and wonderful person as well, but who has been impaired by this fever. And so the two of them are sort of opposites in that way. It isn't that Kendra is a bad person who always gets Cathala in trouble, although she does. It's just that she really is struggling with the effects of this fever, and trying to do that within a community that's oppressed. And I wanted to look at how does that play out for a person, under those circumstances. So the two of them those are two of the things I was working out with both Cathala and Kendra.
And she's very much beloved by the town. Kendra is very much beloved. We were speaking, and this is a narrative that's been with you for 20 years, but it's pretty incredible. The truth sometimes always lives in fiction. Somehow it's difficult to separate fact from fiction. And there are a number of issues that are central to the book that are now being played out in terms of our everyday conversations around politics, like prison reform. You were saying something about Jay-Z and Mississippi, and there's very much a character who's pivotal. All of the characters are pivotal to the plot. And we were also saying that, now Meghan Markle is moving to Canada, right? She's, here you have these people who, this family who looked at Canada as, they didn't stop in Maine. Right. They were like, there has to be something more here. And what was the other topical issue we were talking about?
I think those were the main two we were talking about.
And the police, the prison reform,
yes,
but also the police violence and what happens when one has an encounter with the police, because you don't know which way it's going to go in the novel.
Yes, one of the things that I was thinking about with the Meghan Markle, the movement, was that, the story really is on the ground there in Canada, and what is the situation for Indigenous people, people of color, blacks in Canada. And I think that really is one of the narratives that I'm interested in terms of, sort of exploring. It's one of the reasons why I sort of was doing the book. And I told Patrik that other things that didn't get in the book was research I had done on other parts of Canada. It isn't simply that people moved to the sort of Atlantic provinces. Blacks also moved up into the middle part of the country, in Edmonton and Saskatchewan, and also in the other part of Canada as well, into Vancouver. During the 1850s, about 500 blacks went up to Canada. They were invited there by the mayor of Vancouver, who was a multiracial man as well. So blacks went to other parts of Canada as well. And so the story really is how are these communities doing these days? The Prince and Meghan are sort of flying into the situation, but what situation are they flying into really is I think, an interesting question.
Right, and so I wanted to, our favorite thing, so this cover, which is just startling. So talk about this image, this photograph.
Well, as I mentioned, there was a big to-do about the town in the 1960s. There was a big brouhaha. The residents were not very happy about being asked to move out of their community, and so they fought it tooth and nail. And so before they left, a photographer came in and began to shoot pictures of the residents. And the woman on the cover, even though she looks like she's older, she's actually 16 years old, and she's actually still living. And I went up to Halifax and I interviewed her, And there's also a museum in Halifax called the Africaville Museum, and the director of the museum said, hey, why don't you interview Brenda Steed Ross? And I interviewed her, and also I have a picture of her that you could use for the cover. And so that wound up being the cover of the US edition.
This was going to happen come hell or high water. just know that. And then we have the overlay of the particular community. And so, how has it been now that the book is now with the public? That you had this 18 years, and then the year and a half that we worked on it together, and now it's in everyone's hands. How does that feel?
Well, obviously it feels wonderful to have the book out in the public, and now to be able to talk about it. I mean, I've been sort of keeping it close to, I don't think, I see a few faces that I recognize in the audience. I'm not sure that I showed it to anyone, a few people here and there, and so I didn't really pass it around or anything like that. Part of it did get published part of it was excerpted in a literary magazine, some of which got cut. However, for the better, but I hadn't really shown it to anyone, and so now that it's out, one of the things I've been surprised about actually is the degree to which people really are interested in a lot of the history around the book before they read it. For example, I mean, if they're just beginning to read it, they get very interested in what's the history that's in the book as well. So that's interesting to me to have conversations with people as they're reading it first, and get people have been emailing. I got an email from one from Vancouver about the book.
Already?
Already, yeah.
Oh, but they may have Africaville.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's published in Canada.
It's published in Canada, and actually it will be published in France in French next year, fall
yes.
20. Yes, yeah. It's global. Q&A. Yes. Okay. So, does anyone have any question or? Yes.
I was just wondering. Was there any, as you were doing your research, were there any surprising details that you were like, this is so strange, I can't put it in a fiction novel because people won't believe it? Or was there anything that you felt that was just so unusual that you discovered any gems as you were doing your research?
Well, one of the things that you do when you do research, I think, is you bring your own present ideas about current situations to what you read. And one of the things that I found interesting was when I was reading I was talking about the War of 1812, and I was reading some of the proclamations by these British generals and admirals and people, and they were so earnest in what they were saying. They were telling blacks, leave your masters and come to us to Canada, and where you will be received with all due joy. It's words like that in these proclamations, and I'm thinking, wow, it sounds so earnest. Yet when they got there, the reality was so different. And so, looking back, and that was one of the things that I had sort of difficulty with as I was working on the book. When you're situating the characters in the actual 1918 or 1800s, you kind of have to put aside some of those notions about how we think about how they ought to operate. It came up when I can't really tell that part of the book.
No,
when something happens in the book, how the characters respond to certain kinds of troubles. I mean, they didn't have the civil rights movement; hadn't happened yet. So when things happen in these communities that were, that they didn't like, how do they handle them? And so I had to really think about, what were the limitations of these characters, but also what were their strengths? What could they also use to get their way when things were coming up in the community? And so that was one thing that I was reading some of the documents. It was some of them were tough to read, and so you said, wow, this didn't come out about the way they thought it would.
Yeah, and Jeffrey even, whatever the time period is, he's specific about what the food was at the time that was popular in that particular region, or what the flour was, or what nature would have been like, what a winter would have been like. So the exhaustive detail is pretty remarkable because it's subtle. So it's not you're reading along and you'll stop and you'll go back and you'll think, oh my gosh, wow, you really have captured 60s Birmingham. Like, who would know? I mean, because on one hand, we would think what we knew about Birmingham, but you have someone passing for white, and so he had a whole different reality.
What I just wanted to say that one of the reasons I came to hear this is because I have a good friend who lives in Prospect Heights whose family went from Jamaica to Nova Scotia, and I think is part of that community. He grew up here, so I was very interested in that. But I was also curious why you changed the name from Africville to Africaville.
Well, I ran into another agent at a party a while back, and she said, "Well, you got one of those last deals in which you actually, got to work with a different editor, two editors. So I had two editors, one in Canada, HarperCollins Canada, but HarperCollins Global, you guys get everything else. So it was sold as globally except for Canada. So I worked with a different editor in Canada who you know pretty well.
And she and I worked together as well. Said we had a seamless collaboration. At first, yes. I was like, "What are you doing here?" But then she was actually quite wonderful. She's a legend in Canada.
But her idea was that because the people in Nova Scotia specifically, and also in Toronto, would have heard of the town of Africaville. In Canada, it might make sense to call it by that name in Canada. So that's why we went with the name Africaville in Canada.
Although the Canadian editor tried to get me to call it Africaville in the United States, and I'm like, that's not going to happen. But you were saying that you were inspired by the Africa towns as well.
Yeah.
That the Zordon, Hurston, Barracoon, that's one of the Africa towns, and so.
When I originally started working on this novel, I actually was thinking about doing something in this town called Africatown in Alabama, of course. Zordon Hurston wrote a novel about it, and also memoir and all kinds. So it's been a lot written about Africatown. It's this town in the southern part of Alabama that's sort of received the first slave ship, the last slave ship. But so there's been a lot written about that, and I wanted to give the readers something they haven't had before, a new story, and so that's one of the reasons why I decided to set it in Canada.
Okay, and we have about enough time for 2 more questions. I think I saw that hand first.
Okay, I haven't read one word, but it just feels so cinematic. And I just wonder if you have any ideas of a screenplay. I know that's jumping ahead, but that's a feeling I'm getting.
Well, certainly I will not be writing a script. I mean, I can barely manage fiction. I know my limitations since I've been working on another novel, so I don't have any plans to write. Someone else mentioned that to me. I don't really have any plans to go at it myself. I've had some preliminary conversations with my agent about that. We've been sort of working to try to get the book out there and publicized, and once we get that going, I think that will be something we can talk about.
Yeah, I'm sorry to expose this publicly. I should have told you, but we just had a meeting with an extraordinary Hollywood personality, and we always, do like a goodie bag with the books that we have. We do. I mean, yes. We have home training, and so when she looked at the goodie bag, she saw Africaville. She said, "This wouldn't be set in Canada, would it?" And I said, "Yeah." And so, there's some interest.
Hello. I was wondering if you plan on setting any of your further writings in that same, like dealing with some of the people who got cut out or something like that, in another bit of writing.
Well, I am working on another novel. It is a historical novel, but not in Canada. That's all I will say at the moment.
All right, thank you. Please join us in the cafe. We'll do a signing with Jeffrey, and let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you.